Hello again! So today's video is about one chapter, and that's because I realized that this chapter has a surprisingly large amount. The chapter, of course, I'm talking about is At Flourish and Blots. And what I find very interesting about this chapter is it gives us a surprisingly good comparison between the wizarding world we're being presented with and our own Muggle world, or the real life. Because there are surprisingly a lot of things that happen in this chapter that we could see in a lot of ways as also possibly happening in our own world. For example, when Lucius and Arthur get into a legitimate fist fight. Like, for being two fully grown magical wizards, they're not throwing spells. They're beating each other up, to the point that Hagrid has to physically pull them apart. And there are photos of it. And people are embarrassed, but they also are really getting into it. Like, there are the people who are like, yeah, fight! And then there are those who are like, please stop fighting, like, oh my god, what are you doing? Like, you're two grown men. So we have this connection to this world that we don't always recognize is something that's there. Because these people aren't so totally different from us that they can't respond in sudden anger with their own bodies. And I find that very interesting. And this connection then allows us to consider the different ways that the magical and the Muggle world compare and contrast. And there are two sort of really interesting ones that I found as a comparison that we can look at and a contraction we can look at. And I want to start with that contrast because it started out just like this little thought in my head, and then I wrote a good over half a page about it for my notes. Because I was looking, of course, we have our first instance of really obvious magical travel, which would be the Floo powder, which Harry promptly messes up royally. And I think we all understand that, because all of us are like, how else are you stepping into a sooty fire and not coughing on your words? Like, that seems to make sense for us. But what I found interesting is this points to a big difference between the magical ways of transport and the Muggle ways of transport. You even have the comment made where the Weasleys are like, how did you get to Diagon Alley before? And he says, we took the tube, we took the subway. And Arthur, of course, is like, ooh! Because he's interested in Muggle things. Like, it's a very obvious comparison here, but it seems, and we'll see this with the other magical forms of transport, particularly the port keys, the apparition, and even the night bus, is that all of these ways of transport are actually extremely uncomfortable in one way or another. They're very dizzying and difficult to control if you don't know exactly what you're doing. And, like, you get out and you're tired and you're dizzy and you're feeling nauseous. And that seems to be very odd because with the Muggle world we've always had, particularly nowadays, this want of comfort along with convenience. And much of the time we actually consider part of convenience is in fact the comfortableness of the way we're traveling. It's not considered a convenient mode of transportation if it makes us very uncomfortable, especially if it makes us nauseous or dizzy or sick. There are people that get car sick that don't consider cars that convenient because I'm suddenly having to deal with the fact that I'm feeling sick. But all of these instant or near instant, when it comes to the night bus, we'll see, modes of transport are actually extremely uncomfortable. The only really comfortable ones we see necessarily in the magical world are those that almost mimic very closely the Muggle world. That would be the Hogwarts Express and possibly the Weasley's car. Because again, there's that question of how much they can control that one. But the Hogwarts Express is considered very comfortable and quite enjoyable, and it's a steam train. Like, it might go from a magical place to a magical place, but it itself, as close as we can tell from what we have in the story, the train itself isn't magical. It's a steam train. And to then have this Muggle means moving between magical places, it's its own liminal point, it's its own between space. So it gets this combination of Muggle and magical that makes it a comfortable and also, in that way, convenient ride, but it's not instantaneous. This ride seems to take most of the day because it leaves at 11 and they get there in time for supper. But if you want instant, you're going to lose that comfort level. So that makes me wonder then, when it comes to the magical world, is this sort of a warning that in order to get one thing, you're going to have to give something up? We're going to have this balancing act. If you want spontaneous transportation, you're going to have to give up the comfort level. If you want the comfort level, it's going to take a little longer, like the train and like the car. And so it also becomes a question of, does that rule then apply to the other spells we're seeing? Do you have to give something up in order to get something in return? For some of the smaller spells, this might not seem really important, nor even really obvious. For example, Lumos. What are you giving up in that moment that you're making? That's not a question, but I think it's definitely going to become a major question of what do you pay in order to receive these magical benefits when we get into some of the bigger ones. But the fact that you're seeing it, in fact, with their transport, which all these wizards and witches are using, it means there's a deeper root. There's got to be some exchange within this magic here. So I think we should definitely keep our eye out for that. The other thing I noticed is, it's certainly a comparison, and one that, except for like maybe about 2, are like super close to the Muggle world. Within this chapter, we then are faced with this question of how do we rate a person's worth in this society. That probably sounds odd. What actually happens in this chapter is we get quite a few sets of scales that you can go sort of up and down from all of these different characters that we're actually meeting, that allows them to rate other people within their society. And it's these scales that I'm saying there's sort of, other than 2, most of these scales actually apply in our world. There are judgments we are making about ourselves and other people that then communicate to us the worth of other people in comparison to us. And most of these you're probably not doing consciously. A lot of these are probably subconsciously how you're raised and what society's telling you, and in fact, again, where you're sitting on that different set of scales. We all make judgments about people we meet. And we can learn not to make judgments in certain ways. We can learn that there are certain things that don't actually prove your worth in society. And we can learn to apply those recognitions, but we're still always making these judgments. And I've got quite a few little scales going on. I started going across the page and then I had to come up a little bit. The first one we see really obviously is with Lucius and Malfoy, and that's the question of how magical you are, between like super powerful and Muggle. How magical are you becomes a question. Rich to poor becomes a scale, again, used with Malfoy. Light magic and dark magic then comes in, the light arts and the dark arts. So for the Malfoys, it's dark arts better, light arts probably not. For people like the Weasleys and Harry, light arts better, dark arts worse. Let's see how that switches. With Harry at the Weasley's house, we get kindness and unkindness. If you're kinder, you're better in the society than unkind people, considering that Harry's been living with unkind people. Like, yeah. Lawful to illegal actions. If you obey the actions, the laws, versus if you go against them. Famous, again, being higher up and not famous. We see this with both. We see it more with Lockhart, but it's certainly applied to Harry too, especially when, like, the press gets a hold of them. Suddenly everyone's like, yay! Intelligence versus non-intelligence. This comes in an interesting place. This actually was brought to my notice in this chapter by Lucius, because he tells off Draco for not being highest in his class. And Draco says, well, he blames Hermione for it. And, well, Lucius is making a judgment about his son. Since he's not top of the class, he's worth less. And then there becomes also this sort of question of gender, because the magical one comes in. But Lucius's argument is, you're beaten by that girl from a non-magical family. So there's also there a question of gender. Is there also the scale of being male is still better than being female in this society? And then the last one I've got added here, which again came up with Lucius, and I think you can also see it a little bit with Lockhart, is this question of culture versus counterculture. And you have to fit into the culture of the society to be worth more to that society than if you go against it. And I say this came up with Lucius because, again, this isn't a moment where he's telling off Draco, because Draco's complaining about, oh, that stupid Harry Potter, and Lucius actually tells him that it is not safe to appear against Harry in a society where Harry is considered the hero. So it becomes this idea that it's sort of hand in hand with this famous to not famous, but you have to then recognize society's judgments. It's almost this separate scale that is then applied to all the scales. If society says that, for the most part, magical people are better, then if you like non-magical people, you're going to be outcasts. And we see this. It happens with the Weasleys. A lot of people consider them blood traitors and muggle lovers because they're not considering that magical is purely better. Or they're at least allowing for the worth of non-magical folk. Because again, there are some points in time where there is a question of whether or not they're still saying, well, muggles are a little lower because they don't have this. But they're at least saying that muggles do things that are cool. They figured things out. And that goes sort of back to that contrast of, have the muggles actually figured out something that the wizards haven't with this question of comfort? So again, if you think that, if most of society thinks that being rich is important, but you accept the not rich, you're going to enter into that counterculture. Which is sort of interesting because all of these scales can be switched. Because, or at least you can handpick the ones you want to obey. Because the Weasleys certainly aren't the type to say, like, if you're not rich, you're not worth anything. The Weasleys are poor. So they're not about to, like, throw themselves under the night bus on that one. They're saying, no, there's other things that are better judgments of your worth in society, and they're focusing on things like the kindness to unkindness and the lawful and illegal side of things. But we can always apply that culture and counterculture, and Harry is always throughout the series going to be one of the people that is constantly traveling up and down this culture and counterculture scale that we've got going. Because there are points where he's society's hero, so he is with the culture, and then everything will turn on him in an instant, and he'll suddenly be on the other end. And I think, well, we're going to see this when it comes to the heir of Slytherin question that we have to face as we get deeper into this book. Okay, So, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. And I will see you next week for even more Chamber of Secrets. Have a good one.